Hi, and welcome back to episode 18 of Bible Mechanics. And this is the second part of what I began last week that I titled Back to C.S. Lewis, and now the Quadrilemma. C.S. Lewis famously popularized, he didn't invent the trilemma, but he popularized it through a radio address. And I read to you last time an essay I'd written called called Lunatic, Liar, Lord, or Legend. That fourth element, or legend, is what makes it a quadrilemma, or some people say tetralemma. But I think quadrilemma is the term I've seen more often. And I don't mean to suggest that it's become commonplace, but what it's sort of done is it causes people who want to defend the claims of Christ to sort of set aside Lewis's trilemma, because they realize that folks today have been induced to believe that there's a possibility that Jesus is legendary. And this has been led first and foremost by modern Bible scholars over the last 300 years, but especially in the last, say, 50 to 70 years, because it's been popularized and spread throughout society in such a strong way. And probably the most well-known modern Bible scholar is a man named Bart Ehrman. And he has become very successful in writing books for the mass markets which sell, because he's very entrepreneurial. He's very commercial, and he knows how to turn a phrase to be very provocative, but ultimately defensible if you equivocate enough, and which is what he does. And so he's sold a ton of books, and not just popular books, but also textbooks as well. So a lot of kids going to college have learned what they know about the New Testament from him. He teaches, and I think has taught at the University of North Carolina for probably a couple of decades. And he brags about how he gets all these kids in from the Bible Belt and just sort of shocks them. And he defends himself by saying, well, I'm just trying to introduce them to reality, and they're entitled to keep their faith and that sort of thing. But he really is I think of him as the apostle of agnosticism, the defender of doubt, because he's all about, we can't know. He describes himself as an agnostic-leaning atheist. That sounds excessively complicated. But he defends it. He's an agnostic-leaning atheist. Now, he insists that Jesus really did live, and that he was a teacher, and that he died by crucifixion. He'll stand by those facts very, very strongly. In fact, he wrote a book. I think the title of it was "Did Jesus Exist?" I read the book, and it was his argument against Jesus' mythicists. Because he believes what he believes, he said, a lot of people come to him thinking he's going to support the Jesus mythicist idea, and he makes absolutely clear that he doesn't. And as he does in, so far as I know, all of his books, he makes the point that his views are not his alone, but are the views of modern scholarship in general. He's just simply telling us what they are, what those beliefs are. So he'll say, for sure Jesus lived, for sure he's a teacher, for sure he died on a cross under the orders of Pontius Pilate. But then you start getting into, well, what did Jesus say? And that's when all the doubt comes in. That's where all the agnosticism comes in. That's all, well, we don't really, we know this and we don't know that. And I'll keep reminding you that this point of view that he expresses, he's constantly saying is not his own, but is the view of what's called modern critical scholarship. It is the results of the methodology of what is called historical criticism. And I will explain that in the next episode. But this episode is to finish up what the point I was making with the essay, which was we no longer have a trilemma. We have a quadrilemma, and we've got to deal with this issue of legend. Can we really know what Jesus says? Now, what he really said. And, the theory of modern scholarship is that, first of all, we don't know who wrote the books of the New Testament, except for 7 letters from Paul. They're called the 7 undisputed Paulines. Paul actually wrote 14 letters, but they say that 7 of those 14 that are ascribed to him were not really written by him. And the way they say they know this, well, we've read these letters in the original languages, which you people out there, people like Mike Gant, you don't know Greek, so you can't read it. We've read them, and it's clear that Paul wasn't the one that wrote them. Now, I just as a common man, I reject that, the premise of that thesis on its face, the premise being that writers are always going to write in the same style, using the same vocabulary, expressing the same views. Now, they'll say Barth and if I say Barth or modern scholars, just use those interchangeably. But they'll say, well, yeah, but he can't be having different theological views. Well, they may appear different, but they may not be different. And it may be that he grew in his views over time. The apostles sure did. There was a time when Jesus told them to go, we're not going to the Gentiles. And then there was a time when he said, okay, go to the Gentiles. During the Gospels, he told them, look, I was sent only to the house of Israel. But then in Acts chapter 10, he sends Peter to preach to a Roman centurion who was clearly a Gentile. And so anyway, you've got there are various good reasons why views might alter, but modern scholars say that no, can't be. And so they say, we only know who the authors of 7 of those letters. That means 20 letters or 20 texts in the New Testament, including all 4 Gospels. We don't know who wrote them. And specifically regarding the Gospels, which are the biographical accounts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, they say it certainly wasn't eyewitnesses. There may be some eyewitness testimony that was passed on, but basically these people were learning from each other by oral tradition, and so-and-so told so-and-so, and that second so-and-so told a third so-and-so, or on down the line. And Ehrman's most famous example is the telephone game, where one person, one child says a word or a story or a sentence to the next child and the child after that. And then you go to a long string and nobody's supposed to hear it until you get to the end. And then it's totally different from whatever the first statement was. But that's not at all the way these things that happened, and I don't have time to unpack that now. Maybe we'll do that in one of these upcoming episodes. But Bart Ehrman and modern scholars say that the only way we can know what Jesus says, we have to look for other corroborating sources outside of the Gospels. They look for certain features, like they have certain criteria, like is it something that would cause embarrassment? That's one of the things they use. Is it, like the women reporting that Jesus was raised from the dead? The testimony of women was usually not accepted in courts in that time period. And so they say the fact that it was mentioned that women saw him at the tomb, that would kind of be embarrassing. So there's probably some truth to that. And it's the whole thing of historical criticism, as I said, I'll get to next week, or we won't be able to cover it all, but I'll give an introduction to the methodology. But it excludes certain things, accepts certain things. And the result is nobody can know what Jesus said. Like, nobody can know what Jesus said unless they're either one of these modern scholars or they have access to him. because those people can, look underneath the covers and they know the original language and they know the other sources, and they can tell you which things are not. And one of them, hang on a second here. Well, not one of them, a group of them called Jesus Seminar, which I think I've mentioned before. But this was a book that has been put out in the last, 20 or 30 years. The 5 Gospels. What did Jesus really say? And they go through and they identify, well, he probably said this. He definitely didn't say that. He could have said this. Unbelievable. I mean, they basically make the Gospels unreadable for someone who really wants to know the truth about Jesus. The interesting thing about Ehrman and modern scholars, though, is when they want to say something negative about Jesus, all of a sudden they can become pretty firm about something he said. Ehrman wrote a book called Jesus, the Prophet, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium. And he makes the point in that book, or wants to make the point, that Jesus was a failed prophet because he promised that he would return in the lifetime of his disciples. And to Ehrman's point of view and the view of modern scholarship, obviously he didn't, so he's a false prophet. And he quotes from Jesus where Jesus said, you shall not finish passing through the cities of Israel until all these things take place. And there's 3 verses out of Matthew. I think it's Matthew 10:23, 16:28, and 24:34, all which point to Jesus coming back in that last generation. And I believe all those verses, and I believe Jesus came back, but he came back spiritually and not physically. But Ehrman doesn't, he doesn't buy that. He's saying he didn't come back physically, so he didn't come back. But my point is that he's very, very sure of what Jesus said in that case. 100% sure of what Jesus said, because he wrote a whole book about it. But then if it's something that makes Jesus look good or looks like a prophet, a true prophet, then it's like, well, we can't really be sure he really said that. It was probably inserted after the fact. It's just despicable is what it is. But they have planted doubt in the minds of people today. And so people who are exposed to this, and there have been many, many people who have been exposed to this way of thinking. Certainly anyone who's studied the New Testament in college has been exposed to this. This is the dominant way it's taught. There are some conservative scholars in the universities, but they are the minority, and they have to be very careful how they say what they say. So the quadrilemma is here, but we've got a solution for it, and that's why you're watching and listening to Bible Mechanics, and I'll keep giving you those answers as we go. Next week, let's unravel historical criticism, and let's see why it's so faulty.